What we have here is a catastrophic failure on the front end. The wheel bearing had separated right here and damaged a bunch of stuff, and there's our brake caliper, and you can see the damage in there done, and I think it split the boot right in there. That's what's left of the caliper. That's what we're dealing with the wheel bearing. And over here we have what's left of the brake bracket, rotor, and pads. We're going to remove this pin, this locking pin in here, and then we're going to remove this nut, and that should be an 1.5 inch socket. On the outside here, we're going to have that 1.5 inch socket to break that nut loose. And then over here, we're going to have this pry bar in place here, and that's just going to hold it from turning. In the back, we're going to have 3 bolts to remove that's holding down that wheel bearing. That's going to be a 9/16 12-point socket in my case to remove those. In order to remove this bolt here, we're going to have to turn the steering wheel to get it angled past the centerpiece. Either way should do, and then we'll be able to remove that bolt. Here's after turning the steering wheel here so we can get this bolt out of the way. We're just going to turn that steering wheel just enough to clear to get that bolt out. Now that we have all those bolts removed, we can use a wedge or we can use a chisel to separate the wheel bearing from the knuckle assembly right here. You can see in my case I've used both this chisel and the wedge to separate that. It's coming fairly good. Here's that bearing removed, and we can see all the carnage in there. And then on the end, and then you just lift off your splash shield here, remove that, and our axle shaft here should just pull right out. Here's the axle shaft removed here, and you can see where it's all wet. You can also see where it's all wet in here too, which indicates that we've probably blown that inside seal inside there, so that will likely need to be changed. What we have is a lot of wear right in here on the steering knuckle. You can see maybe better right here. So we're going to throw this thing back together so we can use it for a couple weeks, but we're going to order a new steering knuckle. We're also going to have to replace that axle seal deep inside there. We're continuing to work on the front end of this truck. It's 2000 Dodge Ram, and in review what happened was the driver's side wheel bearing let go and caused a bunch of problems. One of the things it did was take out the seal on the front axle tubing, and in order to change that you have to take apart your whole front axle. You have to remove your carrier and replace that seal in behind. We had to remove both ends, the wheel bearings and all the brake components in order to get that axle out on that side, and as well as on that side over there. And also too, you don't want to forget to disengage your intermediate shaft, and then you have to remove your carrier. Once we removed all the hardware to get at those axles on either side, we need to remove our steering components because they're in front of our cover here. We need to remove the cover, we need to remove the carrier. So we also need to remove all of our steering components for that. That's going to be your tie rod end and bars. We have a steering stabilizer that gets bolted there. We're going to have both our tie rod ends that bolt on either knuckle on either side. And then we're going to have another connection point right here off the drag link off of the gearbox. You need to remove those because they're in front of the cover, and then once we've removed those and removed the cover, then we can get our carrier out. We can roll that out. You could put a wrench on one of the bolts for the ring gear and then wedge it up against the top of the housing, and then slowly turn your drive shaft to kind of walk that carrier out of there. And again, you want to make sure that you've got your intermediate shaft fully disengaged. If it's still stuck in there a little bit, it's not going to allow that carrier to come out of there. We've laid everything out in the same orientation as the truck here. So this is the driver's side, and over there is the passenger side. So we have our regular hardware that we had to remove. First, we had to get rid of our brakes. So there's the bracket there, and there's our caliper resting on our bench. Once we get rid of the caliper and the pads, then we can get rid of our rotor. Once we get our rotor off of there, we can work at getting our wheel bearing out. We're going to remove the nut and carter pin off the end of the axle shaft here. That's going to go in the end of the bearing. Once we remove that, there's the 3 bolts that hold the bearing in from behind. You can use those bolts to thread them in to the bearing and then have somebody turn the wheel side to side and contact a deep socket to the end of the axle housing there, and then it'll help pop that loose so you're not beating on it with a hammer and chisel. So that should come out fairly easily along with our splash shield right there. Once all that's removed, we can remove our axle shaft right here. Over on the passenger side, we have the repeat process. We have our brakes, our rotor. Once we've done that, we remove our carter pin and nut off the end of our axle, which goes on the end of the bearing. We can remove the 3 bolts from the bearing, do the same thing, crack that loose from the housing, remove the bearing and the splash shield, remove our axle shaft, and here is our intermediate shaft that needs to be disengaged on that side from the carrier so that it'll come out. If you don't have that pulled out all the way, it's not going to let you get that carrier out. In order to move that out of the way, you're going to have to take the cover plate. That's just a splash shield, but there's a cover plate for the actuator and a splash shield there for the 4x4 that actuates the 4-wheel drive. That's going to be a little collet that connects these 2 shafts together, and that's what will connect this for your full 4-wheel drive. At this spot right here, there's going to be a cover and then like a fork kind of thing that actuates your 4-wheel drive. There's a collar that connects these 2 splines together, and that's what's going to get your 4-wheel drive working. You're going to want to remove that cover and remove that actuator and remove that coupler, and once you've done that, you can inch this shaft out from that access hole to disengage it from the carrier on this end. I removed it out entirely, and then we're going to clean everything out and then reinstall everything. Next, we have our front steering components here, and there's the steering stabilizer, and you've got a tie rod end there, tie rod end there, tie rod end there. That one there gets connected to the drag link that's off of the gearbox for power steering. And that one get connected to either end of the steering knuckles that support the wheel bearings. And then our steering stabilizer gets connected to the frame and then to one of these rods right here. So you need to remove all that so that you can get at your cover right here. Not so much for the cover, but to roll the carrier out. You remove all those components, remove that cover, and then you can remove the carrier. And once we've done all that, now we can access that seal we need to change. Just wanted to show that we're having a little more difficulty with this bottom ball joint here, and I've got the press set up, and what I had to do is I had to get the cam torch here, put some heat around the outside and hit it with some penetrating spray, and it still did not want to go. So then I shocked it with the hammer on the ends, on the sides here. I'd hit it on the side, and that was enough to get it to pop and move, and then I had to continue that process. We almost got it out now, but basically heat it, penetrating spray, a couple knocks with the hammer to shock that loose, and now it's coming. Here's a setup of the clamp on the passenger side to remove that upper ball joint. And when we're squeezing this together, we're going to be pushing the bottom up through the top. So we have a spacer right there, and then the way the tools are in here, there's a hole in that bottom one for the bottom of the ball joint to kind of go through that hole, and it's resting around that stud. And then we've got the spacer there, so it's going to push it up into this pocket here. You have to remove the top ball joint first in order to use the same configuration of this tool to remove the bottom one. Once we got that started, I had to put in another spacer piece right in there, and that's going to help us push it all the way out. Also, I'm going to use some heat. I'm going to be putting that heat all the way around the outside where that ball joint has to be pressed out of the bore. Here's our configuration here. So that is the layout of our press, and then we have our top one there. You'll notice that there's a small hole in that one. So that is going to press up against there, which is going to press up against our ring, which goes around the top portion of the upper ball joint there. I've removed that rubber off of here because initially we started with this. You'll see that hole. That hole will go around the shaft and contact right there. And that's why we got rid of the rubber, so it's contacting steel instead of rubber. And then we start it with that, and once we get it started, then I'm going to take this little bushing, which again is going to fit around the shaft and contact the edge. I'm going to be using some heat. I'm going to put that heat around the circumference of the metal here. The heat's going to help expand that and loosen up that friction joint, and then it's just going to aid in trying to get that out of there. If it does not work with the heat, you could shock it with a hammer as well and use some penetrating spray, and it should come out fairly decent. I'm going to use 2 wrenches here, double wrench to get leverage on the end of our tool to press that out of there. Here's a configuration for our tool for the bottom one. Our spacer is going to be on the bottom. We're going to use the plate that has the big hole because that's where the shaft is. And we're going to be pushing from the top, contact that top, and be pushing it down into there. Again, that one didn't come out easy, and it may have spread my tool a little bit trying to get that out of there. But there's the configuration there. That's the tool. That's the bottom joint, and then we're going to use that spacer ring on the bottom, and then this is the plate on the bottom because that stud has to go through that space in that hole there. And again, we're going to set that up. We're going to give it some heat, some penetrating spray. We're going to use a hammer to shock it, and I'm double wrenching for leverage to get that out of there. We've removed the axle seal on the driver's side right there. We use this tool here. This is a big long rod that I had, and then I just machined down a plate with a 1/2-inch hole to bolt on the end of that. And then I didn't even need a hammer, just kind of hit that seal out, and it comes out on the inside. Look, all that is a piece of steel that's turned down 2.1 inches, and then a hole in the middle to use that 1/2-inch bolt to bolt it onto the rod there. Use that, knock that out real easy, and then the next thing I did was I just got like this wire wheel, and I took that wire wheel and I drilled a 1/4-inch hole in a 3/8 bolt, and then I just tack welded that shank onto the bolt, and then I used that bolt to fasten it to my rod here. And that's a 3/8 rod, just a length, a ready rod, and then that end's gonna go in the drill. And that's what we're gonna use to clean out our bore here. And then once we've got it all cleaned out with the wire wheel, I simply just wrap some rags around that and then tape it on the end, and then I just kind of push that in and out of the tubing with some brake cleaner, kind of clean it out real good. Here it is, all cleaned out. We use that wire wheel, we use some rags, clean that tube out really good before we do the seal installation. I'm going to use a little RTV sealant on the outside of my seal before I press that home. Here's a tool that I put together in order to install that seal. It's some scrap bits that I found for my purposes, tack welded some things together, and all it is a 1/2-inch ready rod and some nuts. And then once we set it all up, we're just going to use a 3/4 wrench, and we're going to slowly tighten that nut, which pushes that seal into place. After removing the tool, here's that seal put in place there, and I got that RTV sealant around the outside, try and seal it a little bit better, and I'll show you the tool that I use to press that in. All we have here is a piece of ready rod. On this end here, we just have a big washer, and then I found some scrap steel, centered it, tack welded that 1/2-inch nut on there. So then this threaded rod will thread into this piece, and this will rest up against where the bearing goes for the carrier on the passenger side. On this end here, I just found another piece of scrap metal, a little thicker there, and then I found this. This tool fits just right over the new seal, but it does not fit on this one here. See a little step in there? Well, on the new seal, this inside fit inside the new one, but not on this one here. So different seals, different sizes, but they all serve the same purpose. Find yourself some metal that's going to go around, because the seal gets installed this way. So you want something, a little piece of pipe or something like that, that's going to go around this outside and then contact this one and then push it in. Once you found something that's going to fit that seal, it just simply goes on the rod here, and then you're just going to tighten that nut and slowly push it into place. So now after installing that seal, we can put our carrier back in place, and then we can put our cover back on. I forgot to show installing the carrier, and now I got the cap on. I'm not taking that back off, but the carrier will get rolled into place there. You'll rest it on the bottom, kind of lift it and get it started in where the bearings go, and then use a rubber mallet and kind of tap it into place with the rubber mallet. And then after you've got that in place, then 2 caps will go on. In my case, the driver's side was marked with the orange paint, so you don't get those mixed up. And then you just simply torque down those bolts. And in my case, that was 60 foot-pounds, and that was a 3/4 socket. After installing the carrier, of course, we put this cover back on. I've got the RTV sealant on there. I let that set up for 15 minutes. I just put it on hand tight right now. I'm just gonna let it sit for a little bit more, and then I'm gonna torque it up. I'm gonna use 240 inch-pounds, or I think it's like 19 foot-pounds for 5/16 fastener. And that's gonna be a 1/2 inch socket on there. There's a couple things I've done to my cover here. One of them was I put this plug in, this drain plug, and I've got a video on how I've done that modification before for some of my other vehicles. Another thing I did was I just tack welded some nuts. That's a 5/16 nut there and there. The idea being with those nuts is when you go to remove this cover, you just take one of the bolts that holds it on, put it in there, and those are your jack bolt portions where it'll open up the bottom. And then you don't need a hammer or chisel to remove the cover. Here's our configuration here to install our ball joints. We're gonna install the bottom one first. Here's a part number for anyone who's interested. And again, we're gonna use some Anti-Seize product to help get that in there. We're using the double wrench, and we can use some heat on there as well, but I try not to because I don't want that heat to damage my rubber boot on the bottom there. In our case, we're not gonna be able to fit our snap ring in there because the groove is not showing. We have it seated all the way on the bottom side. But if we take a look there, it's basically the cast of the metal here that's not gonna allow us to put that snap ring in place. And that was the same way the factory one was too. We're gonna have to forego the snap ring and just have it the way it is. And then also too, we put that grease nipple in there. We're gonna grease that. And then we're gonna put our cap back on, because when the axle shaft comes in here, you won't be able to access that anyway. And I think if we put a 90-degree on, it might actually kind of be in the way. It'll be too close to the axle assembly itself. So we remove that, put the cap back in. That's gonna be a 5/16 in my case. Here's a configuration for putting in the upper ball joint. Well, we've got our clamp here. This is gonna be our top portion where that's gonna thread into. We've got our ring here. That ring is gonna slide over top of the ball joint, and it's gonna rest on this shoulder right there. Then we're gonna have this bottom one at the bottom, and then this one here, and this one has the hole. Both those will allow that shaft to go through the bottom there. Here's a configuration for the lower ball joint here. We have our top cap that gets contacted by that. Then we have a spacer. That spacer is going to go around that so that this, when this pushes through, it doesn't contact. I just found a little bushing here with a hole in it, and then that's going to come up here, and it's going to stop about there on this taper. And then there's a hole in here, so that's just going to rest on there. It's going to contact here, and that's where it's going to drive that bottom ball joint up. And I've removed the seal and the nut so you can see that. We've got a few things to go over here as we're assembling the passenger side. Now, the damage was originally all on the driver's side, but we're going to match our components here. What we put on the driver's side, we're going to put on the passenger side. We've got our new brake calipers and pads and bracket there, and we switched that wheel bearing on the other side, so we're going to put a new one over here as well. And while we were at it, we did the upper and lower ball joints. The deepest part of this job is changing this seal, and here's a part number for anyone who's interested. This is the seal that goes on the driver's side. Here's a part number for the upper ball joint, and that's the part number I use for that one. And here's a part number for the lower ball joint down in there. So I torqued the top at 80. I also torqued the bottom at 80. And it's also the same torque that I'm using for the bolts to hold on our wheel bearing as well. So I've torqued everything to 80. On the front here, I'm just going to use the impact to rattle that tight, and then I'm going to line it up, and then I'm going to put my carter pin in there. This is going to be an 1.5 inch socket in my case. Down in here, that ended up being like 13/16 on the top. On the bottom, I do believe that was something like a 21 millimeter. But just know that all of these ball joints will have differing sizes for their nuts that go on there. Some of them are 3/4 and some of them are metric, and you just don't know. technically it is going to be whatever you receive. When you're assembling this wheel bearing, you're going to have to articulate it a little bit here to get some of these bolts in. Sometimes they don't want to go in until you turn it to an extreme degree so that you can get the top and the bottom one in, and then you'd have to turn it the other way to get that third bolt in. There's also a little trick that you can do to help remove this thing. You can take a socket here, put it on the head of the bolt, and have somebody inside turn the steering until it contacts there, and then this will help push the bearing out. Naturally, you're going to have that threaded out, have as many threads as you can engaged into here, but threaded back so that you can break this space here. And if you use this bolt here and that bolt there, you should be able to crack that loose and be able to pry that off fairly easily, and then you don't need a hammer and chisel to try and separate that. Now that we have everything assembled, we're going to install our brake bracket and then our brake caliper and our brakes along with our rotor.